Hi, and welcome to Freak Boy Runs, or maybe even welcome back to Freak Boy Runs. Today, I want to talk about a running rule of thumb that is commonly passed around in running circles. If you've watched other running YouTube channels, you've almost certainly heard of it. It's the 10% rule. I want to talk about what is the 10% rule and how I use it in my running and training regimens, what the good points are and what the bad points are. So sit back, come with me on this Saturday morning easy run, and let's chat about the 10% rule. So, what exactly is the 10% rule? Well, the 10% rule simply states that on a weekly basis, you should never have an increase of more than 10% in your running. Now, it's usually framed around your weekly distance and how much overall mileage you've got through the week. But what often isn't discussed is that it applies equally to other areas of your training. Now, for beginning runners, just focusing on overall weekly mileage is probably sufficient, because as a beginner, you really want to only be focusing on easy miles all the time, and your increases really can focus only on how much mileage you're doing each week. But as you progress through your running journey and start getting into more complicated training routines, including things like threshold runs, tempo runs, different kinds of speed work, maybe strength and conditioning. And I say maybe strength and conditioning, eventually for sure strength and conditioning. But not to digress, the 10% rule really is going to apply to all of that overall. And if you were to try to increase by 10% in all those areas, you're almost certainly going to start to overcook your training. So it really needs to be thought of as a 10% overall rule applied to all of your training. So I would say, if you are a little bit more advanced and you're doing things like speed work and strength and conditioning in addition to your easy runs, if you're including a long run now on a weekly basis, then you want to more likely do something like a 5% rule or less in each of those areas. Or maybe if you're increasing your overall distance by 10%, you don't touch the others in any given week. And you just be careful not to overdo it. Another thing about the 10% rule that I think often doesn't get enough emphasis is that it's a 10% max rule. And that doesn't mean you have to get to that extra 10% every week. It's a guideline. 10% is the maximum. But you can be completely flat and not increase anything at all on any number of given weeks. If you're not feeling it, don't do it. You don't have to increase by 10% every single week. But when you're building, you can increase that 10%, but it's a maximum. Another thing about the 10% rule is you can't just apply it blindly. You know, a little earlier I was just mentioning how it applies to your overall running, not just distance. And that's one aspect of what I mean by not applying it blindly. But also, you can't just think that every single week, even if you're only applying it to your distance, that you can keep adding 10%, because that'll eventually get unmanageable. It can't be done. If you take a 10% increase, say just in mileage, every week for 16 weeks, after 16 weeks, that's over a 500% increase. So if you're starting only running 1 mile per week, well, sure, 5 miles after 16 weeks is probably not that much of an increase. But if you're a recreational runner doing, say, 20 miles per week, and you decide to add 10% per week as part of a 16-week marathon training plan, that would have you doing 100 miles per week by the end of that 16 weeks. And that would be way too much of an increase. So again, it is a 10% max rule. And it doesn't mean you have to increase by 10% every week. It just means you should never increase by more than 10%. You're also not going to just apply it blindly if you've taken, maybe you've got a recovery week in your schedule, or maybe you've had a small injury that you have had to take some time off of running for a week or two. And if that puts you down to very low, minimal, or even zero mileage, then you're not going to start out from scratch again. So, you know, obviously, 10% rule isn't really going to directly apply in those situations. So just don't apply it blindly. For me, I find that I'm generally operating where I might be increasing any given aspect of my training schedule by maybe 5 to 7%, maybe less, maybe sometimes 3 to 5%. And then that's going to allow me to build up a little bit of mileage, build up my intensity a little bit, add to my strength and conditioning. Overall, maybe it's adding to 10%. It's hard to calculate. But the 10% rule really comes down to something more like a 5% rule for me. I mentioned that the 10% rule breaks down when you have a recovery week. You take a little bit of time off for injury recovery, or you take a break, maybe after a big race, like a marathon. And so, what do I do to accommodate that? Well, I actually combine the 10% rule with a slightly more complicated, but really not very complicated, other method. And that other method is that I take the previous 4 weeks, say for example, the previous 4 weeks of mileage, and I average them. And I take that average over the last 4 weeks, and whatever I'm doing this week can't be more than 20% of whatever that average was. And it also shouldn't be more than 10% of the previous week. But if I've had to take that time off, it allows me to break the 10% rule with some confidence, knowing that I'm not really overdoing it, as long as I'm not over 20% of the average of the previous 4 weeks. So it does add some complexity, but it's not difficult complexity, and it does give you the option to be able to know that you're safely increasing your mileage, even though you might be slightly breaking the 10% rule. The other thing that keeping a track of that 4-week average does is it also kind of lets you know a rate at which you may be losing fitness if you do have to take some time off. And so, while I try not to be over a 20% increase of that 4-week average, I also try not to be more than a 20% decrease over that 4-week average. Now, sometimes that may not be feasible, especially with injury recovery. But if you're taking a break and you want to take a few weeks off after you've run a marathon, which is understandable and recommended, then even though I don't really take time off running completely, because I maintain a running streak and a 20,000 steps a day streak, I can watch over that 4-week period, and if I start getting more than 20% lower, then I know I've lost a little bit of fitness, and I know I have a little bit of work to do to catch that up. So, like I said, it just gives me a bit of an indicator on the opposite side of how much fitness I may be losing when I'm taking a bit of a break. Those are my thoughts on the 10% rule. What it means, how it's supposed to work, the problems with it, and how I managed to combat at least some of the problems with it. So I hope you got some useful information out of this video. If you enjoyed the content, please be sure to like and subscribe. And if you have a moment, go ahead and comment and share. And until next time on Freak Boy Runs, Freak Boy out.